Top 10 Lies and Mistakes of Austrian Economics, written by Anthony Migchels on January 25, 2012. In the face of Austrian economics' ongoing onslaught through Ron Paul, the Mises Institute, and gold dealers parading as a, quote, alternative media, unquote, we present the next installment in our series of articles exposing it for what it really is. Another banker mind control operation. Number 1. Bankers hate gold. Nowadays, everybody knows that the 19th century was called the Age of Rothschild. They controlled the gold market and became incredibly rich by lending the stuff to governments. The money power came to be through gold. They love it because it is deflationary. They can tax it with interest. They can create the boom/bust cycle with it, and they control it completely. Clearly, bankers don't hate gold. Europe was on the gold standard for the entire 19th century and left it only in the 30s due to the horrible deflation that was the Great Depression. Populists at the time finally managed to force their governments to get rid of it. They had been warning about its deflationary tendencies forever. Gold is the de facto world currency. Quote, commodity money, if voluntarily and universally accepted, could give us a single world currency requiring no money managers, no manipulators orchestrating man-made business cycles with rampant price inflation. Unquote. Ron Paul, Congressional Record, March 13, 2001. In the old days, Austrian economists would say governments hate the gold standard. Alan Greenspan, one of the more famous Austrian gold-loving bankers, wrote in 1966, quote, an almost hysterical antagonism toward the gold standard is one issue which unites statists of all persuasions. Unquote. Government, of course, is Austrian economics' classic enemy, but the adversary de jure in the truth movement are the bankers. So to sell something, they say bankers hate it. They did face the little problem of the American populace being very hard to convince of this, not in the least because of the book Secrets of the Federal Reserve by Eustace Mullins, who famously described who owns the Fed and how it came about. Mullins, of course, was quite explicit in his analysis of gold being the bankers' favorite currency. But Ed Griffin solved this for them. He wrote an even more famous book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. This is basically a ripoff of Mullins' book with one difference. It proposes a gold standard to get rid of the Fed. In this way, Griffin obscures the truth for millions of people who assumed he was basically saying the same thing as Mullins. Number 2. Government is the main problem. This is the red herring that Austrian economics is famous for. Like the mainstream, it completely ignores the money power. Austrian economics is also incredibly, quote, naive, unquote, when it comes to private interests controlling markets. It will always explain that governments shouldn't mess with the economy, while ignoring the monopolistic inclination of capital. As a result, Austrian economics is the wet dream of the trillionaires, as they will resist any government action against them and their transnationals. Austrian economics will actually blame government for the fact that markets now are controlled by transnational cartels. Why they don't seem to consider the shareholders and controllers responsible remains an open question. To be fair, the analysis of Austrian economics about the negative implications of many regulations is spot on and very enlightening. However, to ignore the power struggle that is inevitable both in the market and politics is so naive and pleasant to the powerful that it's almost impossible to fathom how somebody else could have thought it up than these powerful interests themselves. The fact is that governments all over the world have been subverted by private interests. These said interests are quite homogeneous. This international centralization of power, concentrated around extremely rich banking families, the money power, is the problem. Government is a neutral institution that is associated with a nation. Public opinion can always force its hand. But when both government itself and public opinion are captive to the money power, said government will become quite unpleasant. Soon it will be obsolete as it surrenders its sovereignty to a world government and world currency. Governments, and certainly nations, will never voluntarily surrender sovereignty. These projects clearly belong to the money power. Number 3. Manipulation of the volume of the money supply is the main problem with our money. Another red herring. Manipulation of volume is certainly quite a scourge, but it ignores an even bigger problem: interest. The government currently pays $700 billion per year in debt service for the national debt. It matters not whether she pays this for gold or for paper. We currently pay $150,000 in interest over 30 years for $100,000 mortgages. Most of this mortgage was created by simple bookkeeping the moment we borrowed it. 45% of prices we pay for our daily needs are compensation for capital costs incurred by the producer. We are interest slaves. But if we can have the credit by bookkeeping, then clearly we should get the money interest-free, because it is our credit, not the bank's. Number 4. Gold guarantees a steady volume. This is another very strange supposition. After all, the gold standards of the past saw horrible asset bubbles. The boom/bust cycle has nothing to do with the currency, but whether the money supply is being manipulated. The idea that because gold cannot be printed, it thus can give security about the volume is nonsense. Bankers have routinely withheld vast quantities of specie from circulation, only to use it to inflate the money supply at a later stage again. Number 5. Inflation is bad. It is certainly true that inflation knows problems. Inflation hurts savers, creditors, and people on fixed incomes, but it is pleasant for debtors, of which there are far more than creditors. Also, very important, inflation is associated with economic growth. People stop hoarding cash and rather invest and spend. The one-sided focus of Austrianism on inflation, while actually promoting the horror of deflation, see next, makes it look like they're demonizing inflation in order to make deflation more palatable. Number 6. Deflation is good. This statement is so incredibly favorable for the ultra-rich, who are basically the only ones who benefit from deflation, that it puts Austrian economics in a very bad light. Austrians clearly promote the deflation versus inflation dialectic, with all its nefarious implications. Deflation hurts debtors. It makes their debts and the interest they pay over it worth more. Deflation is a wealth transfer from those holding assets to those holding cash. Deflation destroys economic growth because people rather hold cash than invest or spend it. As a result, deflation on all fronts makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. Number 7. We don't want a gold standard. We want a free market of currencies. This is nonsense, and there are two major reasons as to why. Subpoint 1. In fact, the idea of a currency-free market is quite attractive. In the case that all different systems would receive the same funding and propaganda, such a market would undoubtedly see mutual credit facilities providing interest-free credit prevail. See below. However, only gold, and perhaps silver, but not if they can avoid it, will receive all the attention and funding. In fact, mutual credit will be resisted actively by the money power. This will not be hindered by the government, who just created by decree this new, quote, free market, unquote, because that would be, quote, status interference, unquote. Thus, only gold will circulate. Subpoint 2. If there is a, quote, free market, unquote, then there is Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good money. It means that the units appreciating in value will be hoarded, while those depreciating will be used to pay. Everybody will accept the depreciating unit as long as it is not hyperinflating, because most will want to pay with it, and firms will have to accept them to accommodate their customers. They won't have a problem with that anyway. Firms don't care what the money will be worth in a year. They want to know where they can spend it tomorrow. This means nothing will happen if Ron Paul's proposal to make gold, and also silver, legal tender, is accepted. People will continue to pay with the Fed notes and hoard gold. Also, if you could get a gold-based mortgage costing 5% per year, or a 0% mortgage in mutual credit, which would you choose? Case closed. Number 8. Austrian economics is hated by the mainstream media. While it is true Austrian economics is a fringe, also in terms of media attention, it always has maintained a steady niche. It's not for nothing that Peter Schiff and Gerald Galenti were predicting the crash in the MSM. Lately, Ed Griffin was plugged by Glenn Beck on primetime TV. Judge Napolitano gets all the airtime he wants on Fox News, spouting his Austrianism. Amazingly, the fact that even Fox News will plug Austrianism does not ring a bell with people. Number 9. Fiat currencies are always bad. Another typical device, a dialectic, trying to frame it as paper versus gold, both ignoring interest. But interest-free paper is of course something else entirely. At least it won't suffer from the forced inflation on interest-bearing money supplies, due to interest not being spent back into circulation, but being lent back. There is never enough to pay off all the debts plus interest. During a gold standard, this is deflationary because the money supply can't grow. With paper, this is, quote, solved, unquote, by ever more debt, with ever more interest. Modern mutual credit is inflation-free. Or better, the market is in control of the money supply. It grows and shrinks when it must. Social credit is probably inflationary, but everybody will be fully compensated for it because of the fact that they spend the inflationary cash in the circulation themselves. Meanwhile, the inflation will stimulate production. They are trying to promote the idea that fiat currencies are automatically bad, quote, because the volume will be manipulated, unquote. This is the eternal clincher, killing all rational debate about how to manage all the different parameters in the different proposals. Number 10. The problem is the Fed. The Fed is a symptom, not the problem. The problem is that the money supply is controlled by the money power, which uses this control to enslave us with interest, scarce money, and the boom/bust cycle. The Fed is their vehicle. We want to get rid of it because we want to end the control of the money supply by the money power. It's not a goal in itself. Austrians use this to, quote, fight the Fed, unquote, and gain sympathy and support, meanwhile maintaining the control of the money supply with the plutocracy.